I'm going to share my screen and we'll get on with the presentation. And as Catherine said, if anybody has any questions going through, I'll get on a bit of a roll, but don't be afraid to jump in and stop me. Okay, so as they used to say, you know, I have good news and bad news, and I'm going to give you the bad news first. So just a few basics here. I'm assuming no prior knowledge here, so forgive me if you know some of this stuff already, but I'll go through it reasonably quickly. So some of the things that we're going to cover is what is organic matter, what's soil organic matter, what's the difference between organic matter and soil carbon, and you often hear these terms used interchangeably. How do we measure it? Why is it important? And what's the relationship between soil carbon and soil health? Soil carbon and fertilizer use, is there a connection? Soil testing, we want to know what we're managing. Things that influence carbon capture and things that lose it. How much soil organic matter does my soil need? How often does my soil need soil organic matter? And thirdly, how to integrate soil carbon building practices into your standard operating procedures. How much soil organic matter does my soil need? I think I said that already. Getting paid to sequester soil carbon and getting started, trialing practices on your farm. This is an awful lot to cover in a couple of sessions, but we'll do our best. Okay, so the first thing that I want to kind of contextualize is where does organic matter sit in the overall, you know, soil picture? So these are the components of a healthy soil. 45% mineral particles. Now that might surprise you. This is the you know, the sand, silt, and clay component of your soil. 25% of your soil is air, and 25% of your soil is water. Now I know it doesn't feel like that when you walk across it and drive across it, but that's basically because of the way the mineral particles butt up against each other like a bunch of marbles in a jar, and it's all the spaces in between that's full of air and water. And this is incredibly important for agriculture, and we're going to talk a lot more about that going through. As you can see, the organic matter is a pretty small part of the pie, and much of that organic matter is made up of humus, and a small proportion of it is made up of roots, and a small proportion of it is made up of soil organisms. But let me tell you, this small part of the pie, this is like the computer chip in a computer. You know, you've got all this fancy hardware, and it's completely dead until you put the computer chip into it and it brings it all to life. And that's what this small part of organic matter and the living component of the soil is, what transforms all of this inert material into something alive and thriving. So, you know, I mentioned the mineral component of the soil and the organic fraction. This is just an illustration here. And I like this picture, and I'm sure you've seen things like it before, this kind of fantastic fig tree growing over a rock. Well, the rock is the mineral fraction, and, you know, the fig tree and its roots, you know, at a very fine level, they're working basically to dissolve that rock. Now that might take millennia for that rock to break down, but that rock is eventually going to contribute to our soil. And this is really how soil is formed, through the gradual breaking down of mineral material into sand, silt, and clays. And whether we get sand, silt, or clay is dependent very much on the mineralogy of the rocks that we're dealing with. So what is soil organic matter? So soil organic matter, it's the organic matter component of soil, consisting of plant and animal detritus at various stages of decomposition, and importantly, cells and tissues of soil microbes and substances that soil microbes synthesize. This is a really important part of organic matter, which we'll talk about more. The difference between soil organic matter and soil organic carbon. Soil organic carbon is a part of soil organic matter, and it's a pretty reliable 57–58% of soil organic matter. And the remainder of soil organic matter is made up of nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, etc. All the macro and trace elements, they're all in there, which is why, you know, when you're looking at your fertilizer budgets at the start, say, of a cropping season, generally will make an allowance for the amount of organic matter that's in the soil from last year's residue. And we know that we're going to get a certain amount of mineralizable nitrogen out of that soil organic matter pool that's going to contribute to your fertilizer budget. So that's why it's really important that we think about how we're managing that store of locked up nutrients. So soil organic matter has an absolutely central role in soil health and in soil functioning. So as you can see, the biological functions of the soil, which is what gives soil life. When we talk about soil health, we're not talking about, how healthy is the clay or how healthy is the sand. The clay is the clay and the sand is the sand. We're talking about all the life in the soil that is influencing the behavior of clay, the behavior of sand, and the cycling of nutrients through this whole soil matrix. And it's the biology that drives nutrient cycling, drives carbon cycling, and manages that reservoir of nutrients in the soil. But the organic matter also is an important reserve of nutrients, as I said, but it also holds, through cation exchange capacity, holds nutrients in a form readily available to plant roots. It buffers changes in the soil chemistry, and it forms bridges between soil organic matter and with the mineral component of the soil to make soil structure stronger. And this is where it influences the physical functions, regulates water holding capacity and gaseous exchange. So it really, it's everything. It's the beating heart at the core of your soil. Now, this is an interesting thing. We often discuss this, and all of us, have this intention that we want to leave the land in better condition. What does this mean? So it might mean better fencing and stock water. It might mean more fertility in the soil. It might mean deeper root zones. It might mean better water and nutrient holding capacity. That might mean better natural capital. And you might, there's a lot of interest at the moment in natural capital, and banks are, and we're talking, commercial banks are using natural capital, are looking to natural capital to determine what your creditworthiness is. And there are methods being developed, and I've developed two for accounting for nature, which is really about monitoring natural capital. And what is natural capital? Well, fundamentally, it's higher soil carbon levels. Because if you can increase the carbon in your soil and maintain them at a high level, your soils are going to be performing at a higher level. And it means that if you're able to increase soil carbon, which is something that requires prioritization of soil carbon, the natural capital of your farms are going to improve, your overall productivity is going to improve, the resilience of your farm is going to improve. It's so important. Now, there are different forms of soil organic matter, and I'll keep this pretty simple, and certainly this concept is fairly simple. We've got and it's made a little bit complicated by the fact that there's a few different names, applied to these pools of carbon. So we've got basically a fast turning over carbon, a slowish turning over carbon, and a really slow turning over carbon. So the reason it's really important for carbon to be turning over, and I'm using the terms carbon and soil organic matter interchangeably, so forgive me here, but I probably should be saying soil organic matter rather than carbon, but it's turning over because it's powering the life that is living under the soil. Now, if we understand that this life that's living under the soil has coexisted with plants and has co-evolved with plants over millions of years before we even dragged ourselves out of the slime, plants and soil organisms had really good deals going on. They had worked out how to work together and how to supply nutrients, how to exchange those nutrients for food to power the soil organisms The soil organisms would then went to work underground, creating conditions ideal for plant roots. And I'm going to give you a snapshot of that in a moment. So think of the labile, the slow and the very slow as the currency of soil. So it's, I always say, labile carbon is like cash in the economy. The slow carbon is like your savings, and the stable carbon, the very slow turning over stuff, that's like bonds, whatever they are. But you know, you hear about bonds in, you know, vaults under the ground or something that seems to prop up economies. You know, soil organic carbon works in a similar way. The reason we want to be aware of the different pools of carbon is because they have really different functions in the soil, and they're easily influenced by our management practices. And this is some work done by CSIRO a few years ago that just looked at how much of the fast turning over carbon. So the fast turning over carbon is what is very readily available food for soil organisms. So in virgin soil, there was 118 tons per hectare of this fast turning over pool of carbon. In pasture, there was 116. In cropping, there was 9. Now, this tells us something about, okay, well, if this is happening under cropping, how do we manage for this? We need to be aware of this. And next thing really, well, what are the implications of that? I'm going to give you a kind of non-cropping example here. This is not far from where I live. This is a potato country, very different to Wimmera, but it serves to make a point. We got 2 paddocks here that are 116 meters apart. One's a perennial pasture and the other is a spud paddock. The spud paddock, it was a perennial pasture until 2010. It was cropped for 1 year and then it was returned to pasture in the same year. The carbon levels after the carbon levels, and this was tested in about a few years later. I can't remember exactly what the year was. The carbon levels were 163 tons per hectare in the 0 to 30, 6% carbon. The pasture paddock, it had carbon levels of 213, carbon of 10%, but most importantly, it was the behavior of these soils that was really difficult. When we were coring these soils, they're really sticky and difficult to get out of the core, where the undisturbed pasture paddock, the soil came out really easily. So in one cropping event, now spuds are pretty hard on the ground, as you probably know, in terms of the amount of cultivation that is required and also the amount of chemical and everything that goes on. And all of this has an impact on the carbon levels. And you can see we had this massive drop in carbon from this, from a very, very high level, I grant you, but from this single event. And most of the carbon that would have been lost here would have been that particular material. So I don't know if many of you are as old as me and remember that analog watches, if you've ever taken the back off them, all these wheels are operating, spinning at different speeds, depending on whether it's the second hand or the date is moving super slowly. And I use this as an analogy for myself to remind myself about how fast these different pools of carbon are turning over. Excuse me. Now, I thought it would be helpful to give you this kind of quick run through of how do plants grow. So this is what I mentioned before, you know, the plants grow the same way they've been doing since before the dinosaurs. So over millions of years, there's been a co-evolution between plants and the organisms in the soil, which demonstrates an incredible intelligence in the soil because of the deliberate, you know, relationship building and exchanges that happen between plant roots and soil organisms. And I'm not going to be able to go into that in much detail today, but it's a fascinating world for another discussion. So the original primary producer, of course, is the plant. And through this miracle of photosynthesis, sunlight comes in the plant, carbon dioxide is combined with oxygen, is combined with water, and that simple carbon, hydrogen and oxygen creates the fundamental building block of all life, which is a sugar molecule. And in the bargain, oxygen is released for our benefit. So once we have the manufacture of sugar in some form, then everything builds on that. But way back when, millions of years ago, at the start of, when plant roots were just exploring the soil, the plants realized that they could only access so much soil, and there was an awful lot that was out of reach of the plant. And also the space between soil particles was unreachable for many of the plants. So that, even though the plant roots are growing down, they're not able to exploit all the soil they're in. They're really only able to exploit the parts that they can touch. But a lot of the water and minerals that they're looking for is located in micropores that the plant roots aren't able to get into. So the plants found a few friends that they could do business with. And there are so many of these, we still today don't really know. And what this little table is showing, just look at the top, vascular plants, that's the plants that we're generally working with. There's an estimated 400,000 species on the planet, and we reckon we've identified 350,000 of them, 88%. Go all the way down to the bottom here and look at the bacteria. It's estimated that there's over 1 million different species of bacteria, and we've identified 15,000, like 1.5%. So we're operating in a world here where we have really limited understanding of what we're dealing with. So the special friends that the plant roots made deals with were principally the bacteria and the fungi. And the reason that they made deals with these organisms is because fungi, and mycorrhizal fungi you would have all heard of, they can grow in these micropores where the riches are, and they do deals with plants. So they connect with plants either externally, or some fungi will be allowed to grow inside a plant root, where there is direct exchange of plant nutrients from the soil into the plant root, and in exchange the plant delivers sugars back to the soil organism. So this is how plants grow. This is how nature designed it. But then along came Jones, as they say, and we started feeding the plants because we wanted things to happen faster, and certainly feeding the plants definitely made things happen faster. And we grew huge crops. But feeding the plants made the friends redundant, because where we have this exchange between the plant and the organisms, where the plants don't need the organisms to acquire their nitrogen and phosphorus and whatever else, they don't exchange with the soil organisms. They keep the energy for themselves, and so basically all the workers get laid off. And the workers we're talking about are phosphorus solubilizers. So on the left is one of those mycorrhizal fungi that's growing inside the root of a plant. But outside of the root of a plant, there's lots of bacteria that have a role in phosphorus solubilizing as well, and delivering that phosphorus to plants. We have nitrogen fixers, and this is a cut example of a nodule on a legume. And we remove deep roots, and these deep roots, through that exchange process and through that mutualism with soil organisms, is maintaining the condition of the soil to depth. And when we cleared the vegetation way back when, and the vegetation could have been trees, it could have just been deep-rooted perennial grasses, and we replaced them with shallow-rooted grasses growing for less than half a year, there's an awful lot of soil below the root zone that stopped getting conditioned. And when that stops getting conditioned, it stops working. We tilled the soil, and this is some work that I did in Tassie a number of years ago, and it ranged between pasture soils and potato soils. And what the graph shows is really the degree of disturbance associated with a range of different agricultural and horticultural enterprises. Basically, it's showing the more we till the soil, the lower the number of arthropods. So this was a study looking at the soil life between the micro organisms of bacteria and fungi, and well, all the way up to worms, but things like calembula, springtails, mites, and a host of other organisms that are either just visible with the naked eye or require low-level magnification to identify them. And what happens when we lay the workers off and when we till the soil is we lose soil carbon. And as this graph shows, which is from New South Wales fact sheet, you have a precipitous drop in soil carbon when land is first cleared and when we first start tilling the land. And it drops down to this kind of equilibrium point, which is 50% or less of the original soil carbon. And through improved management practices, we've started lifting that in many enterprises, but it's showing us that there's still enormous potential to increase carbon still further. But our challenges, our management practices that we have developed have not prioritized carbon. They've prioritized yield and profitability, which is great, but we realize that we have to have solid foundations in our soil if that yield is going to be sustained. And the part of the downside too is increased our dependency on external inputs, because that mutualism has been dispensed with, or has the capacity of soils to feed the plant has been greatly reduced. So improving soil health means regenerating these capacity of the soil to store nutrients and to slow release nutrients through management of organic matter. So we need to bring nature, or these, at least have an understanding of these natural processes, back into production systems. We need to use the powerful tools of fertilizers and biocides more strategically, because we need to understand that these have an impact on the natural process, as we've just talked about. We want to tune the engine, and that means we want to see what can we do to make the soil work as efficiently as possible, so that when we do apply fertilizers, that they are going to work as efficiently as possible. They're going to go into the soil and they're going to end up in the plant. We don't want to lose any nitrogen to the air, or we don't want to lose any nitrogen to groundwater. And if we can do that, we can reduce costs, we can increase profit, and we can reduce risk. And most importantly, reduce stress. That's what we're trying to do. But we are farming in a water limited environment, and this dictates so much about the plants we can grow and when we can grow them. And opportunities to increase soil carbon are limited by the way that we, if you like, the only way we know how to grow crops in challenging environments. So the big challenge going forward, and particularly facing the challenges of a changing climate, is how do we change? How do we break out of a potentially negative downward trend in soil carbon and consequently in soil condition, and still remain productive and profitable? These are big questions. I'll pause there just to see if there are any questions. And yeah, so Catherine, kind of back to you temporarily to see if anyone wants to throw up a question at this point.
No worries. If you have a question, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask Declan, or use the chat if you'd prefer.
No one's got any questions. I'm happy to keep going, but
no, it looks like you're off the hook so far, Declan.
Oh, phew, okay. I'll keep going in that case. Okay, I'll share again. Okay, let's keep going. Okay, so you can see my screen again, Catherine?
Yes.
Okay. So let's start with soil structure. Now, we've always said to farmers, well, improve your soil structure. But we haven't really said, well, what does that mean? And what does that look like? And why should I? And how important is it? And, have I got 50% structure? Have I got 100%? How do I know? So what is soil structure, firstly? Well, I describe it as the aeration and drainage system of the mega city that lives below the ground. So in the same way that, we understand that a compacted soil will impede water flow into the soil, whereas a well-structured soil will allow water movement into the soil. So when we're talking about structure, we're talking about this network of pores that start at the surface of the soil and extend down, ideally, to all the way to the bottom, right down to the deepest parts of the soil. And certainly you can imagine before land was cleared, we had every kind of root architecture in there between, you know, great big eucalyptus trees, big shrubs, big grasses, small herbs, you know, massive root architectures. And some of these roots went all the way down to the regolith, down to bedrock, you know, and in mallee situations, we know that that mulga trees, you know, their roots can go down tens of meters down into the soil. So these roots are, and everything that is living in association with these roots are maintaining this, system. But when we compact the soil, we end up in a situation like this where we've got a big flood event. When we till the soil, it's like an earthquake. You know, if you can imagine in that building there was perfect structure in that building that allowed people to move up and down, that allowed the drainage and aeration network to work beautifully. And then when the building is crushed, well, the habitat is impacted, the drainage network, the aeration network is ruined, and that building has to be rebuilt. Well, that's what happens when we put a plow through the ground. All that delicate network is destroyed, and the microorganisms and the plants suddenly have to start work to rebuild that. Now, we build that to an extent in the topsoil, where we've got nice friable soil to sow our crops in. But as we go deeper into the soil, we're relying really on plant roots and organisms to do that rebuilding for us. And as I said, when we remove the deep roots, that material that is deeper down, the structure there just starts to collapse in upon itself. And this happens to different degrees in different soil types and different chemistries. But I liken it to, you know, a mine that is not used anymore. And we all know what happens in an abandoned mine. You get cave-ins because the maintenance of the mine is not happening anymore. And how the maintenance of the aeration and drainage network happens is with bacteria and fungi and all the other organisms that are living down there that are constantly repairing collapses that are happening naturally in the soil all the time. So when we have only a monoculture that of a single root architecture that's growing to a very specific depth, there's a lot of soil that's not really being, that's not really involved in the process, and particularly soil deeper down where there may be deeper supplies of water. So when we talk about soil structure, I use this analogy of this sponge here, because if you can imagine, you look at the sponge and you can see, okay, there's full of holes in it. So when I pour water on, the water flows through the holes and out the other end. If I was to get a magnifying glass, you'd see that there's smaller holes and smaller holes and smaller holes and smaller holes in that sponge. And this is very similar to the way soil is designed. Now, if I was to skeletonize that sponge, if I was to pour some kind of acid on that sponge and reveal only the structure that's maintaining the pore network, what I would find in soil is that the elements that are strongly supporting the walls of the tunnels, if you like, are calcium, magnesium, and organic matter. In terms of strength, organic matter is by far the sturdiest member in that structure. Calcium is by far the next sturdiest member. And I mentioned magnesium because it has a bit of a role, but it has a bit of a role only in terms of its proportion. If we have too much magnesium, that's going to cause problems. So it's the proportions of these things that are very important to soil structure. And then the most important thing really over and above all of that is the soil microorganisms. And as the photo on the left is showing, we've got soil fungal hyphae growing over and through every bit of the soil, and it's functioning like Rio in concrete. It's giving the soil real cohesion. strong aggregate stability. And below the fungi, we've got bacteria who exude kind of sticky goos, and that just helps soil to stick together. So soil structure is very much a mix of calcium, magnesium, organic matter, and biological activity. When we look at soil tests and we want to understand what the soil test is telling us about our structure, and many of us, when we look at soil tests, we're looking at soil tests to tell us how much NP and K to put on, but there's a lot more information in soil tests that can give us an indication of how well structured our soils are. And this is particularly important, I think, in clay soils, and a lot of you would be dealing with fairly fine textured soils where you are. Calcium has to be the dominant cation in the soil, because calcium, magnesium, potassium, we know of them as important plant nutrients, but they also wear another hat. They have a really important role to play in soil structure, particularly calcium, also magnesium, to a lesser extent potassium, and to a very low extent sodium, so long as it's a very low percent. But many of you will know that if you've got too much sodium in your soil, you have a sodic soil, and sodium completely, they wreck the party, because they come in and instead of having a big iron member that's holding up a structure, sodium is like a big cardboard member that when it's dry, it looks strong, but when it's wet, it goes to mush. And if any of you have got spewy soils, you can be guaranteed that sodium and magnesium have crashed this party. So we want to have them there, but we want to have them at relatively low proportions. We want our soils to be dominated by calcium. This is a precursor, if you like, for a fundamental for trying to optimize our structure. And look at the calcium magnesium ratios in your soil test results. They should be between 2.1 and 2 to 1 and 7 to 1. If they're below 2 to 1, chances are you've got sticky soils, you've got heavy soils, you've got drainage issues, you've got aeration issues, particularly on heavy soils. If you were to achieve a 7 to 1 on a clay soil, you'd probably go broke, because you'd have to throw so much lime or gypsum at it that, you know, there might not be a mine big enough. But the point is, if we want to shift away from that lower level in a fine textured soil. If you've got a sandy soil, being a 2 to 1, being a 3 to 1 is quite a good place to be. You don't want to be up at the 7 to 1 end. So it's the relationship between these things. It's the same, you go to a doctor and they look at your blood results, and you need to be within particular ranges for optimum health. Now, there's a lot of debate about where this calcium magnesium ratios need to lie, and even how important they are. But if you understand the relative contributions of calcium to soil structure, we know that we do want to have a calcium dominated soil. And one of the reasons, or the main reason why structure is so important, is because structure has a direct bearing on yield. Now, unfortunately, this is not something that we talk about very much. We talk about, you know, that it's important to avoid compaction, and it's important to have good structure, and it's important to have good carbon. But why? Because it pays. And this is a really elegant piece of work that was done in Tasmania a number of years ago. And I really haven't come across very much research that's quantified the relationship between structure and yield as well as this piece of work has. Now, again, this was done, you know, a very different environment to yours, but the principles are absolutely the same and absolutely apply. And what this piece of work did was it scored the structure of the soil. And there's lots of systems around where you can score the structure of your soil. And it's called, there's one called visual soil assessment, which is particularly good. And if you Google it, you'll get lots of information on this, because various land care groups have got similar, you know, visual soil assessment methods. You score the structure of your soil, and this is a bunch of farms who are putting on pretty much the same inputs to achieve, you know, the same yield. Where a structure score was low at 4, those farmers were achieving, you know, on average 45% of their potential. So it means they were putting all this fertilizer and other things on, and they were wasting most of it because the structure of the soil was not allowing the plants to reach their potential. On the other extreme, where we had growers who had really good soil structure up at the 9 and 10 score, they were putting the same amount of input on, but that input was being used with much higher levels of efficiency, and it was contributing, therefore, and helping to drive high levels of productivity. Who are the productive farmers? Who are the profitable farmers in this equation? And who are the ones that are going out backwards? The ones with the good structure scores are the ones who are operating strategically, whose investments are counting, and who are not wasting money. So I think I'm going to stop here, and I'm going to, yeah, we've got about just over 15 minutes left. So, you know, these are just some questions I'm throwing out there, but please feel free to add your own comments if you agree or disagree with anything that I've said. If you've got, you know, any question you ever wanted to know about soil but were afraid to ask, I'll see if I can answer it. Or if you want to address some of these questions here, which I can copy and pop into the chat box. But I'll stop sharing there.
Thanks so much, Declan. That was great. I've definitely learned a lot myself. I've given everyone the ability to turn their cameras on and unmute themselves. So if you do have a question you'd like to ask Declan, yeah, we'll go from there.
Good morning, Declan.
Yeah.
My name's Max Williams. I farm in the southeast of South Australia, and we're doing a lot of research at the moment on sandy soils.
Yep.
But one of the problems we have also on our clay soils is at about 30 centimetres of depth, there's a white band of it, just like fine silt, that has no nutritional value. So the plant roots are going down to 30 centimetres, utilising that moisture. But as soon as that moisture level's gone, we have a dry off. The roots won't penetrate that white silt. Now the silt's about 25 mils thick, inch in the old scale. You were saying there about ripping to cultivating. We were actually thinking whether or not we do need to rip, but not a full cultivation, just a very fine rip to try and help let that go through. Just wondering whether or not you've had anything to do with that type of situation.
Yeah, I have, Max, and a great question. We call that an A2 bleached layer, and they're very, very difficult layers. I'm heartened to hear that yours is only 25, is only an inch thick, because you can get bleached layers that are much, much thicker than that, and they can be serious barriers to root growth and to access deeper water supplies underneath. Look, I've been doing a lot of work over the last probably 15 years with sodic soils in the Victorian basalt plains, and it's a similar story where we've got the choke on the system. There is sodic soils at about 20-25 centimeters down. And so this practice of subsoil manuring has developed. Have you heard of subsoil manuring, Max?
No, I haven't, but we're looking into using a lot heavier of composts to try and help our sandier soils and to try and build up our organic matter to try and increase them in a dramatic way, but nothing on the heavier soils. We're still traditional fertilizers.
Well, the practice of subsoil manuring is really about reaggregating some of these layers that have no soil structure and that have collapsed down and have formed really significant impediments to rooting. And what that involves is, so my only concern about ripping that, Max, and you might be okay because it's only an inch thick, you might get enough disturbance to mix that in, but that's always going to be a very pasty, gooey kind of stuff that's going to try and clag up soil structure anyway, unless you're really able to redistribute it. But if we're able to rip it and get organic matter down to that depth as well, the organic matter is going to really help with the aggregation of that stuff. And that stuff, you're right, it's a silty material. It's not even clay, you know, it's the worst kind of material. It's so fine that it packs down. And I'm sure it's the kind of thing that you've probably seen machinery bogged in as well, because it'll spew up around the tires when it's wet.
Yep, agreed.
So if you're going to rip it, I'm concerned that ripping alone might not be enough, because it'll just it won't be enough to mix enough of that stuff in. And even if you mix it up, whether it's just going to compound the problem, there's a lot of work is going on at the moment. GRDC have a really big project that's been running for a few years in subsoil manuring, and it's showing some really good promise. And increasingly there are machines becoming available for contract to get in and to subsoil. So we can probably point you in the direction of somebody who can help offline, Max. But what I'd be suggesting would be, if you want to do a trial on an area, if we can find somebody near you, and there are machines near you, to do a trial on a smallish area, take a few hectares out of a paddock and just treat it and see if that's going to work. But it does require very kind of careful application. But I think that's the only sustainable way out of these bleach layers.
Yeah, and that's why we haven't done anything, Declan, was because if we go in with a fine tine at, say, one of the machines we looked at, I think was about 410 spacings, we're only going to put a fine mark through it, and it would then almost like, it'll open, but within a year or two, it would actually close back over again. So our cost per hectare was going to be wasted very, very quickly. So that's why we haven't gone down that path.
Yeah.
So no, thank you for your time, Declan. Appreciate you.
No worries.
Declan, Chris has asked through the chat, is not the removal of the crops we grow negating any carbon addition?
Yeah, well, that certainly is part of the problem, that you're taking an awful lot of organic material out of the system when you remove the crops, and we're leaving a lot of roots and we're leaving a lot of litter and stubble behind. But what the work that we've done in Victoria has shown is that even under best practice cropping, even under best practice no-till cropping, at best soil carbon is holding its own, at worst it's continuing to decline. And there's two reasons for that. One is we've basically got a 6-month fallow. During the 6-month fallow, yes, a lot of the bugs in the soil, go to sleep, but the skeleton crew remains active, and that skeleton crew continues to nibble away at the soil carbon reserves in the soil. And the bottom line is that we're just not, even though no-till is about returning as much organic material as we can, it's still not enough. Soils have a very big appetite for soil organic matter. And in those situations, if we are not increasing soil organic matter, it means we're not returning enough to the system. So we have to figure out, and a really huge challenge in these rain-constrained environments is, how do we get more carbon going into these systems? Now we can import it, we can bring composts in, which we're beginning to figure out how to do in broadacre, because it's always been kind of considered too difficult, too bulky, too expensive, too much, material. But some people are, putting low-level pelletized compost down the tube at sowing, for example. And I did some work up in the Mallee many years ago. We used a pelletized biosolid on a gutless sand, and it really doesn't take much to improve conditions on very sandy soil. So we're getting a bit more innovative in terms of how we can, try and promote biological activity in these systems, how we can increase carbon in these systems. And really, the more we can stimulate biological activity in these systems, that's where the real carbon sequestration is going to come from.
Great. Thank you. Thanks, Chris, for that question. Any other questions from the group?
I'm sure people's heads must be buzzing with questions. Someone disagree with me?
Yeah, Max again here, Declan.
Yes, Max.
we're just doing another, like I said, a study on light sands, and we want to do some yield mapping of the soil structures. That is one question that I did want to know, or there's no easy fix. I know that. How do we get more solids into our soils to try and help create a better pasture? That's, we can go in with compost, but we're going to be looking at putting on, 100 tonne to the hectare to get enough to really be, other than wasting time. Like, we're trying to do we're going to do a trial at 5 tonne to see how we get some information, what we get back out of it, do all our testings, do our soils testing. But what is the answer? Is it, standing crops ploughing back into the ground? Is it like, I'd say, yeah, you just brought up the gutless sands. We have a lot of them around here.
Yeah. Okay. And so you're talking about pasture systems, Max, here? Not
yes.
Yeah. Look, I think, compost is a great thing, and compost has always been a great thing, but we can't use compost to replace lost carbon unless you won lotto. Like you said, it would just take so much, and it would just be it's just completely cost prohibitive. But, and this is a big but, we can use compost to try and kick off, if you like, as a catalyst to try and kick off a positive upward spiral in soil condition. So applying and compost at 5 tonnes to the hectare is great, right? So even though you put it out and it looks like dust on the ground, if you can see it, it's quite disheartening after you spread that.
Agreed.
Oh God, where did it go? But it does count. Because what it's doing is straight away it's going to help with moisture retention. And in water limited system, what's your rainfall where you are, Max?
We're about 21 inches, but we are also adding clay onto the soils as well, Declan, to try it with moisture retention. Our aim is to try and get some good bugs back into the soil.
And are you delving, or are you surface applying the clay, or what?
The surface spreading with a massive spreader that we bought.
Yeah. Okay. And are you tickling that clay then into the surface, or
yeah, what? In the top 100 mil.
Yeah, perfect. Okay, that's great. So clay and clay is, if I say that organic matter is the lifeblood of soil, well, clay is I don't know, is the muscle. Clay can really make things happen. And part of the reason why clay is so important is because it complexes with organic matter. So it protects the organic matter from microbial attack. If you were to apply compost to just a sandy soil, the bugs in that soil are going to go, you beauty, thanks very much. Here's all this food. It's like the supermarket doors are open. But clay is able to protect a large proportion of that organic matter so that it can contribute to moisture holding, nutrient exchange, and become a slow release form of nutrients as well. So clay and organic matter really go incredibly well together. So by introducing clay and organic matter, we're slowly increasing moisture and nutrient retention in that soil. But once we get those foundational blocks in place, we want to think about how we can boost soil biological populations.
Yeah,
there's been some amazing research just come out in the last few years that thanks to some of the sophisticated tools we have now, we can look deeper into soil organic matter and say, where did this soil organic matter come from? Did it come from a wheat plant? Did it come from a ryegrass plant? Did it come from a phalaris? Or did it come from a fungus? And what this research is showing is that from 40 to 60% of the soil organic matter is a product of microbial detritus. Now, this is almost, for me, it was a kind of shocking revelation, because the microbial, and the reason they know it comes from microbial detritus is because they're able to identify in soil organic matter compounds like chitins, which only come from fungus. Plants don't make chitin. So understanding that, it tells us, well, if we really want to increase soil organic matter, we've got to increase the below ground population of livestock. And in very simple terms, the carrying capacity of our below ground livestock is generally equal to the carrying capacity of our above ground livestock. So if we've got a, you know, like those potato soils near Druin, like I was talking about, you know, they have carry, you know, a cow to the acre or better because of the quality of the soil and the amount of rainfall. Whereas, you know, you might need 5 or 10 acres to carry a steer, you know, where you are. So, but the below ground livestock will reflect what the above ground carrying capacity is. And we've got to maximize that. And we've got to think, well, we're farming, you know, above ground livestock, but actually it's the foundational element. It's what happens below ground that's going to contribute so much to our production as well. So we get the compost in the system, and then we say, okay, what can we do to further promote those biological populations? So compost is really good for that. Is there anything that we're doing then that's going to suppress those populations? And generally, you know, biocide use is going to have an impact on those populations, and whether that's herbicide or fungicide or whatever else might be required. And it's not to say don't use them, because you might have to use them, but if we're going to use them, is there something that we can do at the same time, knowing that there's going to be a bit of collateral damage to the bugs under the ground? So our focus, I think, and understanding too that soil carbon and soil microbes are, you know, we can't talk about one without talking about the other, because they're so, you know, intimately connected. So I think you're laying that with what you're doing, the foundations are absolutely there, Max. And then it's about thinking about, well, what else can I do to stimulate the critters below the ground?
Yeah, that's probably the sticky point, Declan, for us at the moment. Is it ploughing back in standing crops, or is it going to be a dry land loosen stand in the end? You know, how can we get the better bugs down there and get them thriving? It is a challenge, but anyway, we want to have a crack. We're all new to this, so looking forward to it. So thank you very much for your time this morning. Appreciate you.
Yeah, no worries. And, you know, just a word on cultivation, you know, like, as we said, you know, cultivation is quite damaging to the to the fabric of the soil. But, you know, we're in the business of farming, we're in the business of growing crops. So I always say, you know, you've got to break an egg to make a cake. So I'm thinking, you know, on that basis, cultivation is fine so long as you know what you're going to do next. So long as you understand, you know, okay, well, there's been this negative consequence from my cultivation. How can I work to overcome that with future actions? And that might be things like using compost or other means to stimulate, you know, microbial populations, which are going to repair, you know, the damage from that cultivation.
Awesome. You have a wonderful day. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Max. Calvin has put a question in the chat, but are you on the phone, Calvin? Would you like me to come back to your question? No. So Calvin's question was, he's up in the North Wimmera region in a cropping area, a crop yield, pardon my pronunciation, Cometian? I'm not
sure what that word is, but he's saying that the yields range between 1.9 and 6.4 tons per hectare. That's a massive variation. You know, it could, the question is it related to soil organic matter? Well, it could be, but I suspect that there's something else going on there, Calvin, to, you know, if you know, have we got different soil types across your farm? If you haven't got different soil types across your farm, if that's one particular soil type, I would say on the 1.9, you know, we've got some serious issues, whether it's, you know, maybe shallower topsoil, maybe an impeding subsoil layer, and whether that's from, you know, that whether that's boron, whether it's clay, whether it's a spewy layer like Max was talking about, that's impacting on access to water. So this is where digging soil pits can sometimes be a super useful exercise, going down to about 1.2 and getting somebody who can look at the soil pit and say, okay, well, you know, we've got topsoil of this, your subsoil has got this kind of texture. I can identify you've got a spewy layer there. This is likely to be an impediment to deeper rooting. So that's where I would go to try and figure that out. But, if you've got the potential to grow 6.4 tons, I mean, that is fantastic. I'd be digging holes all over that 1.9 area and figuring out what I can do to get that up to the mark. And there's a question there from Chris. Chris says, is not the artificial fertilizer we use that has increased our production tenfold that feeds 9 billion people in direct conflict with any carbon increase in soil? Look, I really want to say, I'm not anti-fertilizer. We absolutely have to use fertilizers because we don't get the yields if we don't use fertilizer. But I think what I'm promoting is a better understanding of soil and a better understanding of the way soil is trying to work so that we can be much more strategic with our use of fertilizers. And it's, I can't tell you how many times, I talk to farmers, and fertilizer decisions are either based on what the agronomist tells them, what the accountant tells them. The fertilizer application is seldom made by the farmer based on really good understanding of soil conditions, including some of those structural elements that I was talking about. And with a better understanding of soil and a better understanding of how to use these powerful tools, I think we can significantly reduce our fertilizer use, or at least make it much more targeted and much more strategic. And that might include looking at, and I know you croppers, you look at trace elements, and I think you guys are some of the best in terms of strategic use of fertilizers compared to some other industries. But I still think that there's a lot that we can do to better inform our fertilizer decisions, in the context of trying to increase organic matter at the same time. I'm very much of the opinion that we can have our cake and eat it, and that's what I'm trying to bring about. Fair enough. Thanks, Chris. Okay, how are we going for time, Catherine?
Yes, we've cracked the 9:30 mark. If people are sitting back with a head full of information, and we'll go off after this and sort of try and go through that in their heads, where's the best place from here if they wanted to do a bit of a Google, or where's some trusted sources of information to go from here?
Look, I think it's probably a bit too difficult a question to answer quickly, Catherine, but what I'd suggest is, I hope that when you think about today, over the next few days, the questions will come up. Shoot the questions through to Catherine, and either I'll answer them offline, or we'll talk about them at the next at our next planned get together, which I think is going to be in maybe a couple of weeks' time. Catherine, we have yet to set on the date, but it won't be too far away.
Yes, that's a beautiful segue into the wrap up. We are going to do a second webinar to continue with the topic of soil carbon, delving into more of the soil testing side and the decision-making side on what to do next. So are there any other questions before we wrap up?
I'll just add one other thing too, Catherine, that if there's a particular aspect of soil carbon or soil biology or stuff like that that you want to know more about, I haven't developed the talk for next time yet. So I'm very happy to target it in whatever way you guys want. So send your ideas through to Catherine, and I'll take that on board.
Very good. We will be sending out an online evaluation via email. So there will be an opportunity to provide us with topics or questions that you would like to include in the next webinar, as well as other topics around soil or any other farm operations that you would like to do some more training on. So we will send that out over the next couple of days. I'd like to thank everyone very much for coming along today. It's been really great for us. This is the first webinar we've done on soil health and soil carbon. So I hope that you've all learned something and taken something away. Again, thank you very much to Bronwyn at the Wimmera Catchment Management Authority for giving us the opportunity today, and look forward to seeing you all again in a couple of weeks' time. So that's the end. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.